So over the weekend, George H.W. Bush he's the 41st president of the United States, died at the age of 94. Now, in what is not shocking news, a lot of media pundits and political figures now are writing very, very positive articles about his time in office. Now, again, that's not surprising. That's no duh. He just died, and generally the consensus is you must only write articles that are positive and glowing. And look, to be fair, in this case, it's actually really easy considering what we have in office right now to write positive articles of somebody who actually wasn't a very positive person. Now, what we see instead of an honest portrayal, both good and bad, to be fair, is basically nothing more than a gigantic sugar-coated nostalgia fest for people who are at best deeply flawed human beings. And so I'm going to go through some of his policy, some of the impacts of the policies that he had advocated during his time as president, and we'll make the discussion or whether or not he deserves some of that fawning praise. Now, one example of his leadership, or lack thereof, is during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Now, look, George H.W. Bush, he's an evangelical, or at least caved to the extreme evangelical right wing. And so the result of that is that he put into place policies or prevented other policies or funding from fighting the AIDS epidemic. Now, while he did sign the Americans with Disabilities Act, which actually did include people with HIV from discrimination, and also passed the Ryan White Care Act, he did drag his feet a lot and ended up not being a positive force for the LGBT community. In fact, the only reason that he passed those pieces of legislation is because back then the Democrats were actually a lot stronger than they were now. You had Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy and Representative Henry Waxman that pushed him to pass those pieces of legislation. Other than that, though, without that pressure, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, dragged their feet on gay rights. Now, at the time it happened, by the way, those pieces of legislation, you could even argue successfully that it was too little too late. By that point, 150,000 people had come up with cases of AIDS in the United States, and 100,000 people had died due to AIDS. Now, the Bush administration had refused to address prevention to the most affected community, gay and bisexual men, which, of course, you could simply do by promoting and funding safe sex programs and condom distribution. But that is not what happened. That is not what he did. Now, when ACT UP, the AIDS activist group, targeted Bush in actions at the White House and at his Kennebunkport, Maine summer retreat, Bush said this. He said that behavioral change was the best way to fight AIDS. Behavioral changes. Basically, what he says is, stop being gay and you won't get AIDS. He also said in a television interview that if he had a grandchild who was gay, he would, quote, love the child, but then tell the child he wasn't normal. Because nothing spells love, then, hey, you're a terrible human being and you're flawed. But hey, I still love you. Yeah, that's great things for a child's emotional and psychological well-being. Not only that, but in more of a policy type of realm, he stacked his cabinet with people who are virulently anti-gay. This is Health Secretary Louise Sullivan. And he also protested, his health secretary was protested by ACT UP for his terrible response to HIV, and he joined forces with evangelical leaders to cover up a government-funded study on teen suicide. Now, that study, of course, found that LGBTQ teens were at much higher risk for suicide, mostly because of the bullying and social stigma against LGBT community. Not only that, but in 1992, Bush signed a bill to stop the Washington, D.C. Council from authoring health care benefits to domestic partners of gay and lesbian city workers. He also publicly denounced same-sex marriage and fought to keep gay people out of the military. That's just his record on LGBT rights. There is so much more. Now, while seeking election against Ronald Reagan, or the nomination against Reagan, he did attack supply-side economics as voodoo economics. However, he ended up taking it back when he famously became Reagan's VP. So much of the destruction of the middle class, you can lay squarely at the feet of supply-side economics and the people who, of course, had spread that. He also, during the campaign, had questioned the patriotism of people like Michael Dukakis and did not disavow the racist Willie Horton ad. Now, that's very important. In fact, during a lot of his speeches, he pointed to that ad and say, you know, look, it's the Willie Horton ad. That's why you shouldn't vote for Dukakis. So he didn't disavow it, and though his campaign didn't actually create the ad, he had no problem pointing to it and using it as a political tool to help his election campaign. And of course, that was devastating to Dukakis. Now, Lee Atwater, who was Bush's campaign director, he said, quote, and this is how much they used that ad against Dukakis, quote, by the time we're finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis' running mate. That was Lee Atwater. It was so racist that you had Roger Stone saying, quote, you and George Bush will wear that to your grave. It's a racist ad. You're going to regret it. Roger Stone, by the way, is a very big friend of Donald Trump. It was too racist for Roger Stone. Wow. And look, Atwater too. Later on in his deathbed, he did apologize for using that ad against Dukakis. But you know who didn't apologize for that? George H.W. Bush. Never apologized for using that racist ad. And then, of course, as I mentioned, some of his appointments. Now, he had appointed a very anti-gay health secretary, Louis Sullivan. He also appointed to the court Clarence Thomas and David Souter. Now, what's the problem with David Souter? Now, Souter is a very interesting case because Souter actually ended up helping liberals on a lot of different cases. However, that did lay the groundwork for conservatives now wanting Supreme Court justices as a litmus test for president. So basically, Souter, too liberal for conservatives, so conservatives started demanding that a president basically be open with his Supreme Court justices, his picks, but they only wanted them to pick people who are extremely, extremely conservative. So you ended up having that test on presidents. And so, look, one of the reasons Donald Trump had a lot of support among conservative circles is that he had promised to put very, very conservative judges on the court. And he ended up getting two picks, Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch. Very, very deeply right-wing and very much approved by these conservative think tanks and foundations, right, that push very, very right-wing conservative ideology. Now, Souter, by the way, Souter was not Bush's first choice. His first choice was the deeply controversial Robert Bork. So since he was not able to get that guy through, they were able to get through Souter and then, of course, Clarence Thomas. So keep that in mind. Now, that's not the only thing. There's more. We also have foreign policy. And the biggest one that really stands out is Iraq. All right. Now, journalist Joshua Holland had investigated the lead up to the Iraq War and concluded that the administration had lied and sold the war on a, quote, mountain of war propaganda. Boy, does that not sound familiar. Like father, like son, right? Because it's the same thing George W. Bush did in his lead up to the war in Iraq. Now, for one, Bush told the public that Iraq had invaded Kuwait without provocation or warning. That's not true. He didn't mention that U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, had given an effective green light to Saddam Hussein, basically telling him in July of 1990, a week before an invasion, quote, "We have no opinion on the Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait. So go ahead. We're not going to get involved in if you invade Kuwait." Turns out we definitely got involved. Now, that, of course, was the first Iraq war, Desert Storm. Now, he also made up intelligence, his administration did, about Iraqi forces wanting to push into Saudi Arabia. Now, the administration had claimed that Iraqi forces were basically having a giant buildup on the Saudi border and that they had satellite imagery showing that. That satellite imagery didn't exist, wasn't true. Jean Heller of the St. Petersburg Times acquired her own commercial satellite images of the Saudi border at the same time that they were claiming this and found no signs of Iraqi forces, only empty desert. But that buildup, that supposed buildup on the Saudi border, was enough to trick us into going to war to protect our so-called allies in Saudi Arabia. Now, the war itself, by the way, once we got to war, we ended up killing over 150,000 Iraqi citizens, 13,000 from the direct conflict, and the rest from our forces targeting infrastructure like power and water. And we did so in order to have leverage over Saddam Hussein. It's also estimated that the U.S. dropped 88,500 tons of bombs on both Iraq and an Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. Not only that, but you also had depleted uranium rounds, which caused cancer rates to skyrocket, and of course a lot of bombs ended up hitting civilian targets. These are simply war crimes. And you cannot ignore war crimes. Finally, at the end of his presidency, he also pardoned a lot of Iran-Contra defendants, including Caspar Weinberger, Robert McFarlane, and Elliot Abrams. Now, this is important today. Right now, President Trump, a lot of investigators, the Mueller investigation, hopefully is looking into obstruction of justice charges. When they tried to basically, when Trump got rid of Comey to try to stop the investigation into him. Well, George H.W. Bush might have actually paved the way for a president to get around or to get away with obstruction of justice. Now, how is that? Let me explain. It turns out, Politico, according to Politico, as vice president, Bush had been present at key meetings about the arms for hostages deal that would become the Reagan administration's greatest scandal. He claimed, of course, "Oh no, I was out of the loop." But that's actually not true. Late in Bush's presidency, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh had learned of diaries that George H.W. Bush had kept, which he hoped to introduce as evidence at Weinberger's upcoming trial. That evidence, of course, would implicate George Bush. So what happened? Well, if you pardon someone, that means there's no trial. No trial, no evidence against George Bush, which means, of course, obstruction of justice. In an investigation, he literally blocked a special counsel. Uh-oh. Bush's pardons shielded himself from any more investigations. He got away with it. And now, maybe, that might be a blueprint of which the Trump administration might get away with their own obstruction of justice. If Bush could do it, why couldn't anyone else? If they're smart enough, at least. And now, I have a quote here from David Greenberg. Now, he sums up Bush quite nicely. He said, quote, "Despite knowing better, George Bush often slunk aside to create space in the Republican Party for right-wing ideologues and practitioners of the politics of personal destruction, of which, of course, Donald Trump has taken to a logical extreme. He said then, it shouldn't surprise us to see that others, made of far more malignant stuff than he, have now taken over that space. So, of course, leading to the Trumpification of the Republican Party. So let's look at the record here. While there are some good things, the Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the working with Democrats on clean air legislation, let's be fair, Democrats did pressure him into doing those things. But he was also a dirty campaigner, did a lot of harm to the LGBT community, and of course helped the evangelicals take control of the party, aside from war crimes and of course trying to obstruct justice. Or actually, not trying, he actually did obstruct justice. Now, this isn't to demonize the dead, just for the sake of saying, oh, what a shitty person, what a terrible guy. No, there's some objectivity here, and that's what I'm trying to present. We're not getting that from pundits and politicians. They are essentially trying to whitewash his legacy. I'm giving it to you bare. These are the facts about George W. Bush, or George H.W. Bush. This is the stuff that he's actually done. He is a war criminal. He has committed obstruction of justice. He has condemned the LGBTQ community. And that's just some of his faults. But if you're to listen to the majority of pundits and political figures, those things, look, they don't matter. Why? It's because he criticized Donald Trump, who on the outside seems far, far worse than George H.W. Bush. But in reality, I think they're a lot more similar policy-wise than a lot of pundits will tell you. Preet Bharara, he said that George Bush had served with character, class, and integrity. I don't think that's true at all. I disagree with that. And based on what we know, based on what we can look up and see from his record, I don't think the history books will either. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.